Okay, thank you very much, Chairman, and good morning, everyone. My role here is to elaborate a little bit more, I think, on some of the points that Maurice McCrory raised about the way our government actually operates, because change to the electoral system is often thought of as a remedy to some problems that we believe we have in the way our government actually operates. People often think they reach to reform of the electoral system as the first solution to solve a number of problems. But it seems to me that before thinking about what sorts of reforms, if any, might be desirable to the electoral system, it's a very good idea to think about what exactly we might be trying to reform, what we think is wrong, and how electoral system change might or might not actually address those things, or what other sorts of reforms might be needed in order to tackle the shortcomings that we believe are really the most important ones. Here we are. So here we have a picture of the policy cycle, and I hope this doesn't look too fearsome. It's really a cycle that starts with agenda setting up there on the top by the government. The government sets out the programme for government. Policies are then elaborated within departments. The civil service advises, draws up legislation, and the policy is then adopted and implemented, put it through to legislation by the constitutional procedure specified for the Oireachtas to carry out. Then it's put into practice on the ground, this policy evaluation goes on, and then maybe new legislation, new policies are required. It's pushed back up to government, maybe at a later stage. Outside of this cycle then, of course, is the lobbying activity of interest groups who may wish to have a say about how legislation is formed. And this is a big area, of course, in which we've seen many problems, many actual instances of corruption of the policy process in our country. That's not really what I want to talk about today. There are things that have been instituted to try to address that. We have ideas about register of lobby organisations. We have ideas about controlling expenditure and so on. But what I really want to talk about is this bit here. What the government does, what the civil service does, and how the policy then is managed through the Oireachtas. The policy process. What do we think is problematic? Well, first of all, if we think about the agenda setting or the things that the government does, an issue that arises is the skills that government ministers have. Have they the expertise necessary to handle very complex issues of national policy making, given their recruitment through the routes that Maurice has just described to us? And indeed, does the electoral system itself generate too many incentives for people to focus too strongly on constituency activities? And I think we're all aware of the experience of seeing government ministers from all parties, I might stress, whose proudest boast is about the volume of money that they've brought to their own constituency. And we know too that people often wish to use their local representatives or their ministers to get certain sorts of advantages for themselves or to help them to negotiate certain sorts of rights like medical cards or planning permission or whatever. They use the intermediary person, their local politician. And that these things, I think, have come to the fore as problematic, derailing perhaps policy priorities at a national level. Then when it comes to policy formation, are there issues about the way the civil service itself works, about the skills that the civil service has? This has come to prominence, for example, in relation to the Department of Finance. Are there enough people with high-level qualifications in economics, for example, in the Department of Finance? These are things that we're really only now starting to consider. Maybe these are more general issues. Would any of this be addressed by electoral system change? Maybe there are still problems in policy making, policy implementation that still need to be addressed, that need some other sorts of remedies. And then what about the policy adoption? When policies are actually being put through the Oireachtas and turned into law, can the Oireachtas actually make the government answer hard questions, either about the content of legislation or more generally about holding the government accountable? Can they force the government to ask hard questions? Or are we always going to get the answer coming back from government ministers that we've heard all too often in this country that, oh, the system is to blame, nobody is really responsible? Or, you're not asking the right questions, therefore we're not going to give you the answers to the hard questions that you're trying to ask us. So what is it about what's going on in our government, in our parliament, that make these sorts of problems persistent issues. These are things that I'd like to just raise, which may or may not have anything to do with the electoral system itself. So how to fix things? Now, I know you'll be considering different kinds of electoral system, and there may be different sorts of mixes of electoral system that might tweak incentives one way rather than another. I don't think myself that it's necessarily a bad thing in any sense for politicians to have close contact with their constituents and for constituents to feel that they have a say over who they're going to elect. So I'm sure most people here may well think that is a priority. But whether changing the electoral system one way or another will tackle other things then is for you to consider. But in this context, it may be helpful just to think about how Ireland fits on a sort of spectrum of comparative experience. We're so used to thinking about how things run in our own country that it may be difficult for us to understand that in many respects the Irish way of doing things is actually quite unusual in comparative European terms. So on these 4 items of recruiting government ministers, training the civil service, making the policy process itself transparent and fair, and finally, making the Parliament itself effective. There are structural things and procedural things that it might be good to just remind ourselves of. So the very process of recruiting government ministers, as Moorish has reminded us of, in our country, depends almost exclusively on recruiting the government ministers from those who are elected to Dáil. There is a provision for 2 people to be appointed to cabinet from the Seanad, and it's been used in a vanishingly small number of cases. So Britain uses this more often than Ireland does. We see people like Mandelson being appointed to government in Britain, being, as it were, parachuted in through the House of Lords, appointed to the House of Lords, and then you can become a government minister. Our experiences have been, I think there's been 2 cases, is that right? Very, very small number of cases. So in Westminster systems with fused governments, as Moorish has described, that's how it's done. But it's actually very unusual in many other countries. In some other countries, we have actually a complete separation between government ministers and elected politicians. And anybody who's elected a politician and then to the legislature and then becomes a government minister has to resign their seat in the Parliament. Countries with complete separations include France, the Netherlands, Norway. What they do in those countries is that they appoint their ministers to cabinet on the basis of expertise. So if there's somebody in the governing party or parties who has the relevant expertise, they might be appointed to become a government minister. But they can pull in ministers from elsewhere as well. I mean, Christine Lagarde, for example, was the French foreign minister who was brought in from the private sector because of her special expertise in areas of finance and national budgetary policy. A very common experience is a mixed model, whereby ministers can be appointed directly for their expertise, but don't have to be. And most European democracies have some sort of mixed system like this. So Ireland is out on its own, even in relation to Britain, which it's most like. We're out on our own in relying exclusively on who's elected to the Dáil to find our cabinet ministers. So that's an issue that might not necessarily be addressed by change to the electoral system itself. What about civil service skills and indeed the accountability of public servants for decisions that are made or the advice that they give? How skilled are they? And is this providing enough high-quality expertise to ensure that the quality of the policy that is under discussion in our country is good enough? Well, the civil service has run since its inception in Ireland on a generalist model, modelled on the British Whitehall system, whereby people are not expected to have specialist training on the whole before they join the civil service, and they learn on the job. And increasingly, promotional opportunities within the civil service mean that people have to move around to gain promotion, and the experience that they gain on the job is being dispersed. They have to learn all over again in their next position. So some things that have improved in terms of flexibility and promotions and moving people around are actually diluting the skill set in many ways. And this is, again, we're out on our own. In Britain, they've instituted many reforms in recent years, over the last couple of decades, that pull them ahead of Ireland, things that we haven't done. We haven't caught up with them on things like recruiting from outside the public service directly into the civil service. Mobility between public and private sector is very, very limited. fast-track entry for graduates, accountability mechanisms for people in their posts in the public service, and enhancing expertise. All those things are areas that we're only really beginning to think about in this country. The third thing that strikes me as important in these issues of the policy process I mentioned to you have to do with making rights accessible. If policymaking and the rules over who gets what were very clear and transparent and fair, well then there wouldn't be much opportunity for example, health centres to be allocated in ways that people find somewhat questionable, that are not visibly based on need, for example, or the allocation of policy benefits to constituencies would be done in a fair and transparent way. Similarly, constituents would find it easy to find out what their own rights were. They wouldn't necessarily feel they had to go through a TD or a minister to try to get medical cards or a place on a hospital waiting list or whatever. So there are many things that could be clarified about people's rights and about making the bureaucracy accessible and close to home, as it were. And finally, the fourth thing that I want to stress, and I think in this context possibly the most important, is the control that the legislature is able to exercise over the executive. At the moment, government controls almost everything about the agenda setting, about the timing of debates, about the termination of debates in the Oireachtas. The government gets its own way on passing laws and on ending debates. And this, again, I think is really quite unusual in comparative perspective. I think we lose sense often in this country of how far out on a limb we are. We're really at one end of a spectrum of experience. And what these numbers mean is the degree of government control over the activities of the legislature. In Ireland and Britain, it's almost complete. But again, Britain has pulled ahead of us. They've instituted reforms to make Parliament more effective. In other countries, there's a lot more involvement of both government party members and of backbenchers in deliberations within their Parliament over committees. Whoops. I'm sorry, this should be it. Sorry. Okay, so there's an issue about recruitment to the Dáil itself then. That might have a change in the electoral system might give us more skills. In Germany, for example, it's possible to appoint people directly to the Parliament if they have, for example, a special expertise on tax. They can make a career in the Parliament on the basis of their expertise on tax. They can sit in tax committees in this way through their dual electoral system, one which is a list-based system where the position of somebody on a list can be people can be brought in on lists on the basis of expertise, as well as having constituency-based local representation. So they're the main things, it seems to me, in the policy process we might want to think about, which may or may not be addressed by a change to the electoral system itself. Thank you.